All right, so we have seen in the first hour that all reality is grounded in God, His act of creation, making the world the way that it is, the way that it's continued to operate from the beginning. He's made you and I the way that He's made us, and human beings continue to be the same way from the beginning, reproducing after their own kind and doing the same kinds of things that God created us to do from the beginning because He's the one that chose to make us that way. We saw that the work of the devil is deception, which means to cause you to believe things that are contrary to reality, even if possible, contradicting what your own eyes can see and your ears can hear. And I have argued that the devil has deceived us the most concerning the authority of God and the nature of man. I didn't say it that way, but let me say it that way now. The devil's deceptive work has primarily been about the authority of God and the nature of man. God did not say, "You will surely die." That's a deception about the authority of God. He knows that your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. That is a deception about the nature of man. So this hour is called Doing the Devil's Work. Who's doing the devil's work? Well, man is doing the devil's work, but I am focusing primarily in this hour on media and social media, which I'll get to after I go on a rabbit trail first, because rabbit trails are sometimes fun. So, how did we get to where we are? You look at social media, right? And it's like, how, especially if you're older, and you remember what people were like when they were more normal, and you're like, what on earth has happened? Like, how? Anybody watch TikTok videos? There is some real insanity coming through TikTok. I mean, just unbelievable insanity coming through TikTok. How did we get to this place? Well, our understanding of the nature of man and authority in the world that God has made has shifted, changed, been transformed. And I want to show you a little bit about how that's come to be. So I'm going to go through a few things through history here. We're going to look back at history to find out how we got here. And I'm just going to give you like really very brief summaries of how certain thinkers or philosophers have changed the way that we think, especially in the West, over time. Now, before I do that, I want to explain something about human identity. In the old world, that means even here in the West, several hundred years ago, let's say around in the 1400s, or anywhere in the old world today, in the 1040 window, places in Asia, all over Asia, places in Africa, places in the Middle East where people speak Arabic. I always use the 3 A's. This describes their experience and their understanding of their identity, okay? People don't move around. There's not technology. There's not transportation. So imagine your family's been farming the same plot of land for the last few hundred years, and you're born into that family. What are you going to be? What's your identity consist of? Your identification with your family. You wake up in the morning and you say, well, I'm a Carlisle because I was born among the Carlisles, and we stay here on this plot of land and never have moved. For 10 generations we've been here doing whatever it is, farming. And the people over there, well, they're herders, or they farm some other thing. They have a vineyard or an orchard or whatever. But here we are, we're farming wheat, and we've done this for 10 generations on this plot of land. And I'm not going to college because there is no such thing. I'm not moving away and going to some other place to get work because that doesn't happen either before industrialization. And so I'm here, I'm going to be whatever my parents were. My role is dependent upon my age. If I'm a child, nobody's under me, right? I'm at the bottom of the totem pole here. If I'm a man, if I'm a male child, I grow up to be a man, I inherit the land from my father, and I become the leader of the family. And so that's my identity. Am I a man or a woman? That's my identity. What's my role in the family? That's my identity. Who is my family? Where is my family? We're in this nation. We're on this plot of land. That's my identity. It's all things outside of me. It has nothing to do with what I imagine myself to be. And every one of those things is based in concrete, observable reality. I was born into a clan of people called Carlyles. That's a concrete reality. And we have always been wheat farmers on this plot of land. That's always been a reality. It's got nothing to do with my imagination, my desires, my hopes. Got nothing to do with what I want to be when I grow up. You'll never guess what clothes I wear. Probably much like my family's, the clothes that were provided for me. I didn't go to a supermarket, a super Walmart, and decide, I'm going to wear this kind of a shirt or that kind of a shirt or whatever. It's all defined for me. And it all accords with concrete reality. Interestingly enough, there's much less mental illness in the world than there is today. But we'll get to that. So how do we get to that? To this stark, raving, mad, irrational thing that I see on TikTok. I'm just like baffled when I see it. Piercings, tattoos, raving, ranting, screaming about gender and CRT and white supremacy and all these things. How did we get there? Well, let's go on a journey through time. It all begins with a man named Aristotle. Aristotle was very concerned about the essence of things. What makes water water? What are the essential properties of water that make water water? Before Aristotle, nobody had a self. Nobody thought about the self. But with Aristotle, the self becomes something that we think about. All languages have words for self, right? He did it himself. That's reflexive activity. He did it himself. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the self as something I possess, like I have arms and legs. There is not a self until we get to Aristotle. And he's thinking about what is the essential nature of a human self. What is it about a self that makes us a self? So it starts with Aristotle. I'm going to skip several hundred years to Augustine, okay, Christian philosopher. And Augustine was deeply influenced by Plato and dualism, the difference between flesh and spirit. And he sees in the Apostle Paul this struggle with the flesh and the sinful nature. And he realizes that it's the Spirit of God that illumines the inner man. That's the immaterial part of me that's inside. And so the path to God is my attention to this inner man. So the self that Augustine has now that Aristotle has objectified becomes an internal thing with Augustine. It's something, the actual self is not this flesh that leads me astray, but it's the thing that's inside of me that God illumines to lead me back to Him. And so we have the self having to do with things like thoughts and ideas and emotions and mental states. The self is what's inside of me. Boethius goes further than Augustine. Augustine struggled with this battle between the flesh and the spirit, the internal stuff. But Boethius made the self only about the internal stuff. The self is primarily internal and rational, and it's unrelated to things outside of it, and the self inside becomes the seat of a man's identity. Remember what I said was the seat of, or where identity comes from before? I was born into this family. We were farmers. These people, this land, this nation, these peoples define who I am. Now, where's identity? Inside me. The seat of identity is internal. Now, obviously, because I'm talking about Boethius, 1,000 plus years ago, not everybody, and we got to understand that. Philosophers don't change the thinking of the world overnight. People reading Boethius later took what he did and ran with it. But not everybody believed this at first. I'm going to move ahead to Descartes. This is where the self becomes radically reflexive, like the self. The individual rational self of Augustine and Boethius takes a radically reflexive first-person viewpoint. My perspective is not me within the context of my family and my land, the people that I belong to. My perspective is now radically inside of me, the self. This becomes my perspective. It takes on a radically reflective first-person viewpoint, and the self becomes an autonomous subject. And I've talked about that word already in preparation for this point. The self becomes a subject, not an object that's acted on. It becomes the actor itself. I am the actor. We're starting to move now into this territory where the creature becomes the creator. I'm no longer the object, I am now the subject and the center of moral judgment. I decide what's right and wrong. What does this start to sound like? It's starting to sound a lot like what Satan offered Eve in the garden. Under Kant, it got worse. Autonomy becomes the important thing with Kant. The Western individual self becomes autonomous, which means it acts for itself, by itself, without any input from other authorities outside of itself. It's autonomous, an absolute authority of sorts. And it gains ascendancy and value over community and relationships. That's how important the self becomes. Myself is more important than others, and there's no other authority from outside that has the power to tell me what to do. It involves, his view of the autonomous self involves the creation of a knowing versus a believing person. This was part of his philosophy, a knowing person. See, believing is always, in a sense, an objective activity. I look at something that somebody else has done and I believe something about it. Knowing is a personal judgment about it, in a sense. Is to gain ascendancy over believing. I no longer just believe it, I know it. I have the power to decide what's reality, not to believe that this is reality. I now have power to determine, yes, this is reality. No, that's not reality. And so the self goes further into this idea, this notion of autonomy, outside of the influence of other authorities. And Christian Flanders, a missiologist who has actually written much of what I'm summarizing right now, he writes that this is an idolatrous self rooted in human rebellion in the Garden of Eden. And he says a self shaped, ironically, by Christian tradition to a significant degree. And he's thinking back on the influence of Augustine. Now, I don't think Augustine ever intended or wanted what happened with what Descartes and Kant did with where he started. He never imagined it, he never wanted that. But it did kind of get the ball rolling. The self becomes this internal thing rather than what's outside of me. So I'm not trying to say don't read Augustine, he's bad. No, I'm not saying that at all. We gain many important theological truths from him. But you see how these secular, God-hating men have transformed what Augustine did and made it this thing that is exactly like what we see in the garden. Anybody in the room ever read Descartes, Kant? Anybody read them? Some have. What about Nietzsche? Anybody read Nietzsche, like evening reading, sitting down at dinner? Read Nietzsche here. What about Karl Marx? Ever read Karl Marx? You like it? Enjoyable? Did it change the way you think? Be careful how you answer. Did it change the way you think as you were reading it or before you read it? Interesting question. What about Freud? Anybody here a fan of Freud? It's like, no. Why is he mentioning all these people? I meant to bring my book. I didn't bring my book. I've been reading a book called Strange New World by Carl Trueman, and he brings up these people too. And I've added them to my development of the Western self because it's very helpful. Nietzsche. Yeah, Nietzsche and the art of self-creation. Okay, now the self is not just this internal, rational, autonomous thing, but the self actually has to create itself with Nietzsche. Freed from the metaphysical myth of religion, including the fact that man was created by God, human beings must rise to the challenge of artistic self-creation that defies convention. I have to create myself. I have to decide what I'm going to be and become that. And the best way of doing that is if it defies convention. Because if I follow what everybody else is doing, then I'm not a self-creation. I'm just following the herd. I have to be different than everybody else. Are you starting to get uncomfortable? I've noticed that each one of you is wearing different clothes. Why is that? Did you decide what colors you thought were the best, what patterns you thought were the best, what you liked? And now you're presenting that image of yourself to everybody else through your clothes? Did Nietzsche influence the way I think before I read the book or after? Oscar Wilde, very familiar with Nietzsche's philosophies, and in particular Karl Marx, makes life all about performance art. Life is about me performing what I want the world to think and know about me. All imitation in morals and life is wrong. We cannot follow conventions. We must self-create. That is supplanted by the spontaneous, sexually transgressive, and artistic expression of the self. All of the pictures of Oscar Wilde are in black and white. That's how long ago it was. But think about what I just read. Is that what you see when you see people today? Tattoos, piercings, the clothing, the behavior. None of these people have read Oscar Wilde, but they're all doing what he does. How did we get here from there? Philip Reif, who, by the way, he's a philosopher and a student of Freud. He's outside Christian tradition, but he writes this: "These trends lie behind the death of Christian culture in the modern West, which was replaced as the organizing force of human personality by societal disorder and disintegration as the self. The new center of human personality seeks entertainment as its highest good and boredom as its most common evil." So it used to be that, what he's trying to say here is that Christian culture in the West was the organizing force of human personality. Now, that's in part true. There were other factors, but he says that was the organizing force of human personality. That has been replaced. And what replaces it is societal disorder and disintegration of the human self. And this human self now seeks entertainment as its highest good and boredom as the most common evil. I have to be entertained. And this has, and because each one of us has different aspirations, society has become disjointed, it's become combative, competitive. Nobody agrees on anything. Everybody's out there trying to entertain themselves at the expense of everyone else. Freud and sexual identity. Moving ahead. The inner space of feeling is fundamental to identity and primarily defined by sexual desires. See, the inner space of feeling is fundamental to my identity. What I feel is my identity. And those feelings are primarily oriented around what? My sexuality, my sexual desires. That's who I am. We've seen an explosion of this in social media in the last couple of years. An explosion of it. Some of us have no idea how we got here. But this is what Freud was pushing so long ago that all the pictures of Freud are in black and white. And now it seems commonplace here. How did we get here? So sex is no longer an act or merely an act, but it's a desire that defines what a person is, their identity. And you hear that all the time, right? I'm cis, I'm bi, I'm pan, I'm unicorn, pony, whatever. One more step and I'll conclude with this really ugly, ugly look at our history. Reich and the politics of sexual identity. The psychologized, sexualized self must be affirmed by others in society. It's not enough for me to want to be this way and to express it to you outwardly as performance art. You now have to affirm it. You have to say this is good and it's right. Anything less is psychological abuse and oppression. All the pictures of Reich are in black and white. But this is all over media today, isn't it? Somebody says that they're non-binary, queer, and you don't say, that's great. But instead you say, that's wrong. Well, that's abuse. And we have to have political authorities making sure you don't abuse me. And so now all of this human identity, intensely sexualized, has become a political issue. We're in a really ugly and dark place. And it didn't happen overnight. It's happened over a couple thousand years. And you leave the US, you leave Canada, you leave Western Europe, you're going to find that most people are nowhere near this. They're normal people, born on farms, raised on farms, who know that they are Samnang and they're rice farmers just like 3 generations ago, and their sons will be rice farmers too. Most of them are still, by God's grace, not here. You still believe that we have a Christian nation? Did Nietzsche influence you before or after you read the book? Because these things have trickled down in our society and they have defined how each one of us acts. And I hate to say this, you're all doing it. You're all doing it, just not to the same extremes. You're presenting yourself the way you imagine yourself. Your identity is no longer from things outside of yourself and the way God made you. Your identity, for the most part as Americans, is what you imagine yourself to be that you show others on the outside. You may not be sexually transgressive like Oliver Wilde, but you're doing the same sort of things. Or Oscar Wilde, but you're doing the same sorts of things to a lesser extent. In fact, you probably bought your car that way. You probably chose your career that way. I want to be this. I'm going to make myself this. And that's why Carl Trueman, in his book Strange New World, calls us plastic people. I mean, think about plastic. Plastic is always something that it's not. It is. I used to work in plastics before I was a missionary. I worked here in Detroit. We made carbon fiber out of plastic. We made wood out of plastic. We made metal out of plastic. We made leather out of plastic. You wouldn't believe all the things we made out of plastic. None of it was all that stuff. It was all plastic. It all came from a hole in the ground, went through a chemical plant, came out as beads that were pressed into a mold to be a particular shape, with a particular texture and color. And you get in the car and you're like, wow, I really like the stainless steel thing on your dashboard. No, it ain't stainless steel, that's plastic. We're all plastic people. I struggled with this coming back from Cambodia. Everybody there is real. They are what they are. They are how they're born. And we come here and nobody's how they are and how they're born. They're all what they want to be, making themselves to be what they want. Now do you see where I'm heading with this? Because now the human being is no longer a creature made by God. The human being is a God, lowercase g, made by itself. And that's where we are. And I hate to say this, Christian, you're participating. You are participating. You're doing it too. Not to the same sinful extremes, but you are involved in the act of self-creation. And I'm not really sure at this point how to counsel you. How do we avoid this? Because we belong in a system where this is what's happening. Satan has deceived the entire society around us. Every person you meet and know is involved in the act of self-creation. And it didn't come from all of us reading people like Marx and Nietzsche and Freud. Where did it come from? Why is it so many millions of people are now all doing the same thing and thinking the same thing? Where did it come from? What's the title of this session? Media and social media doing the devil's work. The power to influence millions simultaneously to believe things, true or not, so that they act on it. Let me ask you a question. Tell me the concrete reality. I'm not asking you what the media says. Turn off the media for a moment and somebody tell me the concrete reality of who and what Caitlyn Jenner is. Nobody wants to say it. If this recording is going on YouTube, you never know. One day the police might come to my house. No, tie it to reality. Tell me an objective fact about Caitlyn Jenner. A thing in reality. But I'm talking about, see, that's an idea about him. Okay. Let's talk about birth. That's a concrete reality, right? Birth. Tell me about the birth of Caitlyn Jenner. Born a man. Yep. Strong man, weak man. Tell me about Caitlyn Jenner's name. Yep. Concrete reality. Born a male, named by his mother. That's objective reality. Concrete. What did Bruce Jenner achieve? Multiple gold medals, many other besides, lots of athletic achievements. What is Bruce Jenner now? This is where, if this is going on YouTube, we're getting into some troubled waters. What is this person now? Still a man? Now a woman? What's concrete, objective reality? If somebody were to take a piece of this person's DNA to a lab and examine it, what would they find? Still biologically a male. But we can't say that. We have to believe something contrary to the reality that exists. Our organs of perception would tell us, when we look at that DNA, this is a biological male. But that can't be reality. Perception is different. The act of self-creation has produced a woman. And that self-creation, regardless of the fact that it blatantly contradicts concrete objective reality, is what we all have to believe. And I'm in hot water with governing authorities now for saying that. Welcome to the world we live in. How did we get here? How did millions of people in our country come to believe that Caitlyn Jenner is genuinely a woman? Media and social media doing the devil's work. Remember the point that I pushed, that Satan's work of deception primarily involves the nature of authority, God's authority, and the nature of man. Who and what man is. You know, you don't see media and social media pushing narratives like this. You know, stars are actually cheesecake. No, that doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all. Most of their narratives have to do with the nature of man and the nature of authority, protecting who is allowed to speak and decide what everybody else thinks. And the things that they speak mostly have to do with human nature. They usually fit into two categories: getting everybody to submit to a narrative, whether it be global warming, electric vehicles, this, that, or the other. We have to submit to some authority, or the nature of man, an attack on the nature of man. That's where we are. And now all of media, so when I say media, I'm talking about, television, whatever's left of print, or on the internet reading articles, which has replaced that. Radio, there's some of that left. Any kind of media that's propagating, filling the airs with messages, and all these things are saying something about reality. All these things have to do with what's now called a narrative. A narrative is what you must believe about reality. It's not about what reality is anymore. This started a long time ago. I remember when our kids were still little, one of the major news corporations got into big trouble because they portrayed a Chevrolet pickup truck with side saddle fuel tanks as being spontaneously explosive when it got hit from the side by a car. And so they ran a segment in a news piece on TV showing a Chevy Citation, a car that's no longer made, going into the side of a red Chevy pickup truck and this explosion happening. But they got caught. That wasn't reality. You know what they did? They filled the tank and left the gas cap off. They put a flare, like the kind you put on the side of the road, at the front of the car, and from the angle of the camera, you couldn't see the flare. So the car hits the side of the truck, the fuel comes out, the flare ignites the fuel, and you think, oh my goodness, this could really happen. I started mistrusting media immediately following that. If they're doing this once, when did they not get caught, and who else is doing it? And now that seems like child's play. It's child's play. Because media now is all about the narrative. So tell me some narratives. Let's talk about this for a minute. Tell me some narratives that you hear, and make them like little sound bites, small things that you hear, that all media is trying to get everybody to believe, especially if they contradict reality. I'll give you one, just as a lead-in. Diversity is our strength. Never in the history of the world has anybody believed that. Unity is our strength. But now everybody believes diversity is our strength, so let's diversify everything. In fact, if we're all unified, that's bad, that's weakness. Diversity is a strength. What other narratives do we have? Say again? Big narrative, big media narrative. What do you mean by that? What do they mean by that?
They mean homosexuality is just as good and valid as heterosexuality.
Yep. What else? Tell me something about women that's a media narrative. My body, my choice. Singular, my body, singular. My choice. What's inside of you? Can a woman do what a man does? By the narrative. By the narrative, can a woman do anything a man does? Yep, that's the narrative, isn't it? Okay, well, take away all of our technology and tools and let's try it again. Go back 500 years, we'll see. Not going to happen. Can a man do what a woman does? Can a man be a birthing person? No. What's the narrative? A man can be a birthing person. Don't want to see that. That's the narrative. And it's so thick that reality TV isn't even real anymore. It's all about the narrative. It's all about projecting the image that goes into your organs of perception to change the way that you think. Because if they can change the way that you think, they can change the authority that you will respond to. You understand that? The way you think determines the authority that you will respond to. And that's why it's so important to control the narrative. That's why it's so important to get you to believe things that are not true. There was a video I saw last year. It was shocking. It was a teacher in an elementary school. I think the kids were in first grade, and she kept holding up flashcards. The flashcard would have the number 1 on it and have one object on it, and the teacher would say 3. And she was exercising and teaching the kids to say 3 after her in the face of looking at the number 1 with one object. And then she would pick up another card, and it would say red, and it would have a picture of a red object on it, and she would say blue, and the kids were being conditioned to say blue. And she was doing this card after card, and it was pretty quick, and the kids were all saying what she was saying, looking at the cards, denying the reality of what's on the cards to believe her. Think about how authority has shifted in their experience. They no longer act in the real concrete world based on what their God-given perceptors of reality say. They're following another authority that has contradicted reality. I was stunned when I saw this. Couldn't believe it. It looks unreal. But that's what the narrative does all day long. It's gaining ascendancy over all perception in the real world, so that the people who are seeing and hearing it believe something that may in part coincide with reality and in part contradict it or entirely contradict it. Men can be birthing people. Do you know how many millions of people believe that's true? I know it seems absurd to you because you still have some rational hooks built into your, connecting to your filters of perception. But millions of people believe it. Millions of people believe with all their heart that a man named Bruce Jenner, who wears a dress, is actually a woman. Millions of people believe it. Millions of people believe that they are creating themselves. And one reason why it's so easy for that to happen is because most people in our country now no longer primarily live in the world around them. They all go together and sit down to dinner and pull out their phone. And the relationships that are in concrete around them right then and there are now less important than the relationships that are happening virtually. Everything is virtual. The real world has lost its place in our experience. The virtual world is everywhere. Virtual relationships, pornography, virtual sex, video games, virtual challenges that I overcome. Everything in the real world that's concrete, that's physically visible, physically audible, physically touchable and tasteable and smellable is all going away, and everything is being filtered through an LCD screen. And this occupies more of our time in some cases than what's actually in front of us. And so getting people disconnected from the actual reality of the physical world to believe something that's not true is pretty easy. And they're just like those kids in that school. Their eyes tell them one thing, but they believe something else. Makes me want to throw this out the window. That's media. The master of millions. Whoever frames your perception is your master. They influence what you look at. They tell you what to look at. If you go home at night and you turn the TV on to be informed, they're telling you what to think about. You could have thought about all other kinds of problems in the world, but you didn't. You looked at what they pointed to. Not only that, they're going to tell you what about it you need to know. And even if they don't tell you directly, they're going to tell you what you ought to think about it. Who's your master? They are. They influence what you look at, what you see, how you see it, and then in the end, they influence what you do, what you believe, and what you do. Media is the master of millions and millions and millions and millions. What about social media? How is the social media doing the devil's work? When Facebook first started becoming popular, Julie and I refused to get Facebook accounts. And we encouraged our kids not to as well. Told them outright, don't do it. What's Facebook about? It's about Oscar Wilde, self-creation. It's about performance art. I'm telling everybody what I want them to believe about me. What about other things that are true about you that you don't want them to see? Well, that never goes up. I never show them on my Facebook the reality about me because I'm ashamed of it. I always show on Facebook the things I want them to see about me. It's performance art. It's me creating myself and then showing that to the world. And here's the offer. The offer of social media is this. We're going to give you a platform for self-expression. That's what social media offers. Instagram, you can post pictures of yourself. Twitter, you can speak your mind. Facebook, you can show them what your life is like and what you're like in your life. That's the offer. What's the reality? Is it the same? Is social media about self-expression? Who would say, yeah, social media is about self-expression? You know why it's not anymore? Because if you believe something contrary to the herd, contrary to the masters of the social media companies, it will be taken down and your account will be closed. So you really do not have the ability to express yourself. It was a lie. Social media is now about you conforming your identity to them, to what they want you to do. How do you guys see this? How are some ways that you see this now? You guys use social media more than I'm sure of it. And I don't mean to make you feel uncomfortable if you say, I've seen this on social media. I've seen things on social media too, and I don't have accounts. But how do you see this? Fact checking. You say something, and then there's a flag on your post, or it gets deleted because of a fact check. What else?
Doesn't conform to our standards.
Yes, our community guidelines. This post does not conform to our community guidelines, which means you did not affirm somebody else's sexuality, their identity. Well, isn't what you believe about that person part of who you are? Sorry, you can't be that way. Your post has been deleted. Your YouTube video has been deleted. So this vehicle for self-creation is no longer that. It's now a vehicle for conformity. What else? What else do you see? Close to the word fact check, there's two other words we see now. What are they? Misinformation, and what's the other one? Disinformation. You could say, like, somebody makes a post that Caitlyn Jenner is actually a man named Bruce that won Olympic gold medals. Disinformation. Disinformation, that's not true. He's really a woman. What else? Is there other stuff like that? I mean, how long could this discussion go on if we did it? Go on and on and on. I have here something I want to share briefly, if I can find it. This is a woman who used to be a social justice warrior, and she began thinking about what was going on, and she pulled back out of it. She said, "This is a cult that's very obsessed with language. These have become very common nowadays," she said. "We learn the new concepts they push, like racism and sexism, are prejudice plus power. Looking back on it, I realize now what was happening, that this was a belief system that I was getting pulled into, just word by word." She's actually talking about the words they push, just word by word. My entire belief system was being changed. So she brings up words like white privilege and toxic masculinity and white fragility. And she said, "These words gave me a lens through which I see the whole world." And that's what they're trying to do. They're presenting these ideas, and they're actually confining you on social media to expressing those ideas because it changes your perception filters. It changes the way that you see other people. It changes the way that you think about the things that you see. So for her, the important thing was reflecting on all the little words they push. And now those have gone into the mainstream through the media, and if you don't use those words the same way that they do, you lose your account, because self-expression has always been a lie. That was the bait. But the hook by which the fish is captured, killed, and eaten is that you will conform your worldview to ours. That's the work of the devil. Media and social media have become about presenting an alternate view of authority in the world, and especially about presenting an alternate view of what humanity is. Whether you think social media is good or not, the fruits of it are evident. One of the most dangerous parts of this is that we believe, as we watch these things and we see these things, that we are in control. That we are the ones sitting here judging whether or not we believe what's being said. But so much more is happening. So much more is happening. Your mind is being directed like a funnel into a topic to think about. You turn on the news, they're telling you what you will think about. Through these little words, the implicit comes to control your views. The things that were not stated, if they were stated, you would have said no. The implicit comes to control your views. On social media, the desire to conform to others, which is a good desire in the family, a bad desire outside the family with secular people that hate God. These little words change your worldview, and you begin to think like all of them. It changes your worldview, one soundbite at a time, one little phrase at a time, birthing men, one little word at a time. Media and social media are doing the devil's work. One last comment about that, and I'm going to close with one statement. I've already mentioned this. I don't have a TikTok account. I don't go looking for TikTok videos. I see it once in a while. The stuff that I see is horrific. The deformed human bodies, intentionally deformed. The deformed human identities. I cannot even tell if this is a man or a woman by looking. It doesn't even look human by looking. The rage. You've seen those videos of people on TikTok raging, screaming, anger, piercings. All of this is mental illness. Mental illness has filled our society. Mental illness is believing something about reality that's untrue. And people are doing it by the millions. And our society is becoming a society of the mentally unstable. As Carl Trueman says, they're plastic people in a liquid world. The world's constantly changing. They have no anchor. All of them are drifting, blown this way, blown that way. The human being has become its own creator and its own anchor for reality and found that that is an extremely unstable foundation on which to build. And mental illness is abounding. We have a choice. As believers in Jesus Christ, we have a choice. We can either buy into this way of thinking about the world and their perceptions about the world and their perceptions and ways of thinking about humanity and God, and find ourselves in the same state of mental illness with the God-given organs of perception, seeing things and the mind believing something else. Or we can understand our world correctly through the Lord Jesus Christ. The only way your organs of perception will look at something and rightly determine what it is and live with the stability and comfort and peace of knowing that this is actually, in reality, what it is, male or female, is through the Lord Jesus Christ. The choice to become a follower of Jesus Christ involves more than simply a different lifestyle, attitude, or understanding. Far more profoundly, choosing to follow Jesus involves a choice between different visions of reality itself. That's what's at stake. You can either follow the media and the social media in the work of the devil, or you can follow the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, that quote I need to attribute to Dr. Knowles, a commentator on the book of Colossians. That was not me, but I think he's right. You're going to follow this madness, or you're going to have a different vision of reality, rooted and grounded in the Lord Jesus Christ. And that is the topic of our final session. Thank you. I guess we're at lunchtime now.